Canine Comedy of Grief and Hope by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. The Art of Avoiding Grief Badly. John Gallagher was not a man who embraced change easily. Routine had always been his best friend, his guiding principle, the thing that kept him from floating away into the abyss of uncertainty. Before everything fell apart, his life had been a carefully choreographed dance of predictable steps. Wake up at 6, coffee with precisely 2 scoops of sugar, a run through the park, and then off to his job as an insurance analyst, where numbers and probabilities dictated the chaos of the world in a way that felt manageable. Then, life decided to ignore his neat little plans and rip a hole right through the middle of them. When Lily died in a car accident on a rainy Tuesday morning, the world lost its structure. Routine collapsed like a badly built house of cards, leaving John stranded in a landscape where nothing made sense. He stopped setting his alarm, stopped drinking coffee because it no longer tasted the same, and stopped going for runs because, frankly, what was the point? For the first few weeks, people had swarmed around him like well-intentioned bees. Colleagues, neighbors, Lily's friends, all of them offering casseroles, advice, and unsolicited reassurances that time heals all wounds.
Mrs. Perkins had been the most persistent of them all. The woman was a force of nature, a walking embodiment of chaos, wrapped in floral dresses and an apron that never seemed to leave her waist. She had taken it upon herself to ensure that John did not wither away in his own misery. While her methods were well-intended, they were often exhausting. John had learned early on that Mrs. Perkins had a habit of showing up unannounced. He suspected she was keeping tabs on his activity levels. If she didn't see movement in his house by noon, she appeared on his doorstep, armed with an overcooked casserole and an arsenal of conversation topics that he had no energy to engage with. One particular morning, after successfully avoiding her for a whole 3 days, John had dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she had given up.
He had settled onto the couch, a lukewarm cup of tea in hand, when suddenly there was a knock on the door. It was too cheerful, too persistent. He groaned. Mrs. Perkins. For a moment he considered ignoring it. Maybe she would assume he wasn't home and leave. But then he made the fatal mistake of looking out the window. The moment his eyes met hers, her face lit up in victorious triumph. Damn it. Reluctantly, he opened the door.
"Morning, Mrs. Perkins."
"Good morning, dear."
She beamed, stepping inside before he could protest.
"I brought you something special today."
John looked down at the dish in her hands, the contents hidden beneath a layer of foil.
"Should I be worried?"
"Nonsense,"
she said.
"It's my famous beef and onion casserole."
John had had her famous casseroles before. Famous was a strong word. Mrs. Perkins had many admirable qualities, but cooking was not one of them. Her culinary creations were often so aggressively seasoned that they bordered on inedible. The last time he had sampled one of her dishes, his mouth had gone numb for a solid 10 minutes. Still, rejecting a widow's home-cooked meal was the kind of crime that would put him on the bad neighbor list indefinitely. With a sigh, he took the dish and set it on the kitchen counter.
"You're too kind,"
he said diplomatically.
"Oh, it's no trouble, dear,"
she said, already making herself comfortable on his couch.
"I just worry about you. You spend so much time alone. It's not healthy."
John had long since given up trying to convince people that solitude wasn't the enemy. It wasn't loneliness. It was just less exhausting than constantly trying to pretend he was fine. Mrs. Perkins, however, was determined. "Have you thought about getting out more? Maybe joining a club? Oh, I know. You should come to book club. We're reading 50 Shades of Grey this month."
John blinked. "I'd rather eat this entire casserole in one sitting."
Now, she wagged a finger at him. "Don't be a stick in the mud. You need some excitement in your life."
"I think my life is plenty exciting,"
John said. At that exact moment, a loud thump came from the kitchen. Both of them turned toward the source of the noise. Charlie. John's golden retriever stood triumphantly atop the counter, his tail wagging furiously as he licked the last remnants of the casserole from his face.
"Oh my goodness,"
John groaned. "Charlie, for the love of—"
Charlie, completely unbothered, gave them both a wide, drooling grin. Mrs. Perkins let out a laugh, so delighted that, for a moment, John forgot to be annoyed.
"You see, dear," she chuckled, "even Charlie agrees you need to live a little."
John sighed, rubbing his temples. "If this is living, I think I need a refund."
Charlie barked happily, licking his lips. John knew then that any hope of a quiet life had just gone up in smoke. Chapter 2. A Dog, a Best Friend, and a Comedy Club Disaster. John had always believed in keeping a safe distance between himself and anything labelled self-improvement. Therapy, book clubs, guided meditation, none of it appealed to him. He preferred his own personal brand of healing, which mostly involved avoiding people, drinking too much coffee, and pretending he didn't still talk to Lily in the quiet moments before sleep. Unfortunately, his best friend Tom had other ideas. Tom had been a constant presence in John's life since college. They were an unlikely pair. Tom was loud, brash, and aggressively optimistic, while John had always been content to keep things low-key. Over the years, they had balanced each other out, but since Lily's passing, Tom had doubled down on his mission to drag John out of his misery. His latest idea? Comedy night.
You need to laugh, John, Tom had insisted. Laughter is healing. It's science. It's also a Tuesday, John had replied, and I don't want to go. Too bad we're going.
John had tried every excuse in the book, but Tom was relentless, which was why, an hour later, he found himself sitting in the dim, sticky interior of the Chuckle Hole, a comedy club that smelled vaguely of beer and broken dreams. John slumped in his chair, arms crossed.
This is a terrible idea. It's a fantastic idea, Tom countered, waving to the waitress for a round of drinks. You need to get out more, have some fun. Look at this place, full of life, energy, bad decisions.
John scanned the room. The crowd was an eclectic mix of office workers, students, and people who looked like they had wandered in by accident and decided to stay. A man with an unfortunate mustache was currently on stage, sweating under the spotlight as he attempted to tell a joke about his ex-wife's obsession with astrology. John sighed.
This is painful. Give it a chance, Tom said. I promise by the end of the night you'll be laughing.
John wasn't so sure. He reached for his drink, only to realize that the condensation on the glass had made it slippery. In slow motion, the beer slid from his grasp, landing directly in his lap.
Fantastic! Tom snorted. See, now that's funny. John saw him a glare.
The night continued in much the same way. Some comedians were decent, others were objectively terrible, and one particularly nervous guy ended his set with an apology to the audience for wasting their time. John was about to declare the whole night a bust when the final comedian stepped onto the stage. She was different, confident, quick-witted, and funny. John wasn't sure when it happened, but somewhere between her bit about the absurdity of online dating and a self-deprecating joke about turning into her mother, he realized he was actually enjoying himself. He was laughing. Genuinely.
Tom nudged him. Told you.
John rolled his eyes, but didn't argue. As they left the club later that night, Tom turned to him with a smirk.
See? You don't have to be miserable all the time. John sighed. I'll allow it, but don't push your luck.
But as he climbed into his car, he found himself thinking about the fact that for the first time in a long time, he had felt something other than grief. Maybe, just maybe, Tom was onto something. Chapter 3. Therapy, Grief, and a Dog Who Knows Too Much. If there was one thing John disliked more than talking about his feelings, it was paying someone to make him do it. And yet, every Wednesday at 3 p.m., he found himself sitting in Dr. Evelyn Peters' overly pastel office, perched on a couch that was just a little too soft, staring at the kind-eyed woman across from him. Dr. Peters was good at what she did. Too good. She had a way of making silence unbearable, sitting patiently as John squirmed under the weight of unspoken words. He had tried everything, deflection, sarcasm, pretending to fall asleep, but she saw through all of it.
So, she said now, her voice calm and measured, how was your week?
John sighed. Eventful. Tom dragged me to a comedy club against my will.
Dr. Peters smiled. And, did you have fun?
John hesitated. I tolerated it.
Dr. Peters chuckled. Tolerating fun is a step up from avoiding it entirely.
John huffed. Let's not get carried away.
Dr. Peters leaned back in her chair. And how's Charlie?
At the sound of his name, Charlie, who had been curled up on the floor next to John's chair, lifted his head and let out a deep sigh, as if this conversation was as exhausting for him as it was for John. He's fine, John said. Still stealing food like a seasoned criminal. I caught him with my toothbrush last night.
Dr. Peters raised an eyebrow. Your toothbrush?
John nodded. I found him under the dining table, chewing on it like it was a bone. He looked guilty as hell.
Maybe he's trying to tell you something, she mused. Like, He thinks you should be smiling more.
John snorted. Or he's just a menace. Charlie let out a small huff, clearly unimpressed with being called a menace.
Dr. Peters studied him for a long moment before speaking again. You know, John, I think Charlie is doing a better job looking after you than you realize.
John frowned. What do you mean?
She smiled. Dogs have a way of sensing when we need them. They don't judge, they don't try to fix us, they just exist with us, and sometimes that's exactly what we need.
John glanced down at Charlie, who had flopped onto his side and was now snoring loudly. He's a real therapist, this one, John muttered.
Dr. Peters laughed. Maybe so, but he's also proof that you're not as alone as you think.
John didn't have a response to that, because as much as he wanted to argue, he knew she was right. And Charlie, with his stolen toothbrush and ridiculous antics, was more than just a dog. He was his lifeline. Chapter 4. The Great Sock Heist and Other Domestic Disasters. John liked to think of himself as a relatively competent adult. Sure, he wasn't the most social person, and yes, his idea of cooking was mostly microwaving leftovers, but he could keep his life in order. Charlie, however, had made that increasingly difficult. It started small. A missing sock here, a mysteriously relocated shoe there. But as time went on, it became clear that Charlie had a gift, not for obedience, but for strategic chaos. One particularly disastrous morning, John was rushing to get out the door for a meeting when he realized one of his shoes was missing.
Charlie, he called. Where's my shoe?
Silence. He turned, only to find Charlie standing in the doorway, tail wagging, eyes suspiciously guilty.
What did you do?
Charlie pranced away, clearly thrilled with this new game. After 10 minutes of searching, John finally discovered the missing shoe, inside Charlie's water bowl. Dripping wet, soaked to the core, completely unwearable. Charlie sat beside it, looking immensely pleased with himself.
Why?
Charlie just licked his nose and trotted away, his work here complete. The shoe incident should have been a wake-up call, but it wasn't the worst of it. That came later, when John discovered Charlie's secret stash. He had been vacuuming, an activity Charlie considered a personal attack, when he decided to finally move the couch and clean underneath. What he found shook him to his core. Socks. So many socks. There were at least 15 of them, stuffed haphazardly under the couch like some kind of bizarre hoarder's collection. Some were his, some were unidentifiable, and one, disturbingly, belonged to Mrs. Perkins. John had no idea how Charlie had managed to steal socks from another household, but given Mrs. Perkins' frequent visits, it wasn't entirely impossible. Charlie, sensing he had been caught, immediately rolled onto his back and gave John the biggest, guiltiest, I am a sweet angel look imaginable.
John sighed. You're lucky you're cute.
Charlie thumped his tail against the floor. Victory. Chapter 5. A date, a disaster, and a dog who doesn't understand boundaries. John hadn't been on a date in years. Not since Lily. The idea of putting himself out there again felt exhausting, not to mention terrifying. But after relentless pressure from both Tom and Dr. Peters, he finally caved and agreed to meet someone for coffee. Her name was Claire, and she was a veterinarian, which Tom, ever the optimist, had declared a perfect match because she loves dogs, you have a dog. That's basically marriage material, John. John wasn't convinced, but he figured one coffee couldn't hurt. He should have known better. John was already nervous, but he had no idea the true disaster would come from his own home. He had planned to meet Claire at the cafe down the street, but before he could leave, Charlie, perhaps sensing the shift in the universe, refused to be left behind. It started with puppy eyes, then whining, then full-blown melodramatic tragedy, complete with Charlie throwing himself against the door like he was being abandoned forever.
John groaned. Oh, come on, Charlie, it's 1 hour. You'll survive.
Charlie disagreed, so much so that, the moment John cracked the door open, Charlie barreled past him, escaping into the front yard with the speed of a professional sprinter.
Charlie!
His dog, his menace, was already halfway down the street. With no choice, John chased after him, looking like a madman in dress shoes, dodging pedestrians while his golden retriever gleefully galloped toward chaos. By the time he caught up, Charlie had already reached the cafe. And, because fate had a sick sense of humor, he had found Claire first. John arrived just in time to witness Charlie launch himself at her in pure, unfiltered joy. Unfortunately, Claire had been holding a coffee. Now, the coffee was on her shirt. Charlie, oblivious, wagged his tail proudly, as if this was exactly how greetings worked. John skidded to a stop, horrified. Claire, dripping with coffee, looked stunned. Then, miraculously, she laughed.
Oh, wow,
she said, shaking her head. Well, at least I know you're an animal lover. John blinked. That was not the reaction he had expected. Charlie, still wagging, looked immensely pleased.
John sighed. This isn't how I planned this.
Claire smiled. It's fine, really. I've had much worse things spilled on me at work.
John exhaled. Maybe, just maybe, this date wasn't doomed after all. Chapter 6. Charlie's attempt at matchmaking, or sabotage. After the great coffee incident, John had been convinced that Claire would never text him again. To his surprise, she did. Had fun yesterday. Let's try again sometime, preferably without the coffee bath. John stared at the message for a full 5 minutes, half expecting his phone to explode from sheer disbelief.
You really didn't ruin it, Tom said when John told him later. It's almost like she's a reasonable person who understands accidents happen.
John snorted. Accidents don't happen with Charlie. He's a force of nature.
Tom grinned. Maybe he's trying to set you up.
John rolled his eyes. More like he's trying to make sure I never leave the house again. Still, despite his dog's interference, John found himself agreeing to a real date. A dinner, something normal, something not involving hot beverages flying through the air. Unfortunately, Charlie had other plans. The evening of the date, John was determined to be on time. He had showered, put on a clean, and hopefully Charlie-proof shirt and made sure his shoes weren't mysteriously missing. It was going well, until he noticed Charlie watching him, sitting near the door, staring. John frowned.
What?
Charlie blinked, as if deep in thought. Then, without warning, he sprang into action, grabbing John's belt right off the bed and bolting down the hallway. The dog disappeared, belt in mouth, like a furry criminal with an escape plan. By the time he caught Charlie, under the dining table, chewing happily, the belt was compromised. As in, it now had dog teeth-shaped holes in it.
John groaned. Charlie, what the hell?
Charlie wagged his tail, completely unbothered. John checked his watch. He was now running late. With no other choice, he grabbed an old belt that barely fit, threw it on, and sprinted out the door.
Your dog is in my house.
John's stomach dropped. He quickly replied.
What?
I left the door open while bringing groceries in. He ran in, stole a slice of ham, and now refuses to leave. Do you want me to keep him overnight?
John rubbed his temples. Claire, noticing his expression, tilted her head.
Everything okay?
John sighed. I think Charlie is crashing at my neighbor's house.
Claire blinked. Then she laughed.
You know, she said, for a dog, he's surprisingly good at stealing the spotlight.
John groaned. Yeah, tell me about it.
Chapter 7. The Ham Bandit Strikes Again. John had always known that Charlie was smart. Too smart. But breaking into a neighbor's house for ham? That was a new low. After Claire had stopped laughing at his predicament, John excused himself from their date early and hurried over to Mrs. Perkins' house, mentally preparing himself for whatever mess Charlie had made. He knocked on the door.
Your criminal is in the kitchen, she said.
John peered inside, and sure enough, there was Charlie, sitting in the middle of the tiled floor, wagging his tail, with a slice of ham still hanging out of his mouth.
John pinched the bridge of nose. Charlie, for God's sake.
Charlie chomped down on the ham as if to say, too late, it's mine now.
I don't know what you're feeding him, dear, but it must be terribly inadequate if he's resorting to burglarizing elderly women.
John rubbed his temples. I swear he eats better than I do.
Then maybe it's a moral failing rather than a hunger issue.
John muttered, wouldn't be the first time.
After apologizing profusely, John finally coaxed Charlie out of the house and back into his car. As he drove home, he glanced at the dog in the passenger seat. Charlie looked immensely proud of himself.
You're ridiculous.
Charlie wagged his tail.
You can't just steal ham from old ladies.
Charlie yawned.
And you ruined my date.
At this, Charlie perked up, as if pleased with himself. John frowned.
Wait a second.
Was this on purpose? Had Charlie, his own beloved furry companion, orchestrated this entire thing just to get him to cut the date short? He narrowed his eyes.
Are you sabotaging me?
Charlie stretched lazily, completely unbothered by the accusation.
Oh my God, you are.
Charlie let out a big, satisfied huff, settling into his seat. John swore he was smirking. Chapter 8. The morning after the crime. John woke up to a golden retriever sprawled across his chest. Charlie, in all his 80-pound glory, had decided that his human needed to be crushed under the full weight of canine affection.
Charlie, get off.
Charlie did not. Instead, he rolled onto his back, exposing his belly in a dramatic plea for attention.
John sighed. I don't know if I should pet you or call the cops after what you pulled last night.
Charlie, unbothered, yawned loudly. John shoved him off with great effort and sat up, rubbing his face. A text from Tom was waiting on his phone.
So how was the date? Did you confess your undying love or did Charlie sabotage you?
John frowned.
Option B.
Seriously, what'd he do?
Broke into Mrs. Perkins's house and stole Ham. Had to leave the date early to retrieve him.
I have so many questions. John sighed. So did he. Later that morning, just as John was debating whether or not he should move to another town where no one knew about Charlie's life of crime, his doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Perkins, holding a plastic container.
John opened the door cautiously. Please tell me that's not another casserole.
Mrs. Perkins huffed. No faith in me at all, John. It's muffins.
You bake?
Mrs. Perkins smiled sweetly. No, dear, but I buy from people who do.
John smirked. Fair enough.
She handed him the container and patted Charlie on the head.
Despite his questionable morals, I do find him charming, she admitted. He reminds me of my late husband, always getting into trouble, always knowing exactly when to flash those big brown eyes to get out of it.
Charlie wagged his tail, delighted by the comparison.
John sighed. He's got the con down to a science.
Mrs. Perkins grinned. Don't let him fool you. He just wants to make sure you don't forget how to live a little.
John hesitated. That was the second time someone had said something like that, and it was getting harder to ignore. Chapter 9. A second date, Charlie free, almost. After several days of reflection and about 6 muffins from Mrs. Perkins, John finally did what he should have done immediately. He texted Claire.
Hey, sorry again about the whole coffee disaster and the ham incident.
Oh, don't worry. It was entertaining.
That's one word for it.
So dinner redo if your dog approves?
John sighed and glanced at Charlie, who was lounging on the couch like a king, one paw draped dramatically over his eyes. John narrowed his gaze. This time, Charlie would not interfere.
Yes, this time I'll leave Charlie at home.
You sure he won't break out of the house and track us down?
I make no promises.
John was determined to have a normal date. This meant extreme precautions. All doors locked. Charlie well-fed and bribed with a giant chew toy. Mrs. Perkins on emergency watch duty.
John's phone buzzed.
It was Mrs. Perkins.
Your dog just escaped through the side gate. He's heading toward Main Street. I think he knows where you are.
John stared at the screen in horror.
Claire, noticing his expression, raised an eyebrow. Charlie?
John nodded slowly.
Before she could respond, a commotion erupted outside. People were gasping. A waiter dropped a tray. And then, like a golden, chaotic hurricane, Charlie appeared, charging straight through the restaurant's open doors. John buried his face in his hands. Charlie spotted him instantly, practically vibrating with joy. Then, because Charlie was incapable of normal greetings, he launched himself at John, paws first. John's chair tipped backward, and in one spectacular motion, he found himself on the floor, covered in dog kisses, while Claire laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her own chair. Chapter 10. The aftermath of a dog-induced public spectacle. John lay on the restaurant floor for a moment, staring at the ceiling, while Charlie enthusiastically licked his face as if he had just saved John from a burning building instead of ruining his date. Around them, the restaurant was dead silent. Then Claire started laughing again. Not just a chuckle, full-on, can't-breathe, face-in-her-hands laughter.
John groaned. I swear I didn't plan this.
Charlie happily wagged his tail, as if to say, Sure you didn't, buddy. A waiter cleared his throat.
Should I get you a towel, a broom, animal control?
John sighed deeply. No, but maybe a glass of wine, a very large one.
Claire finally caught her breath. Okay, I take back everything I said before. Your dog isn't just a menace. He's a romantic saboteur.
John sat up, rubbing his face. Yeah, I've noticed.
Charlie stood proudly, completely unbothered by the chaos he had just caused. As John got to his feet, covered in dog fur, dignity completely shattered, the restaurant patrons clapped. John blinked.
Claire grinned. I think you're famous now.
John groaned. Kill me.
The waiter handed him a napkin. On the house. You've been through a lot. Charlie, still unaware that he had just made John's life exponentially harder, thumped his tail against the floor, delighted with his performance. John had no choice but to escort Charlie back home mid-date. Claire, being an unreasonably good sport, walked with them. Charlie, trotting happily between them, acted like nothing was unusual, as if this was just another casual night out with his favorite humans.
John sighed. I don't even know how he escaped this time.
Claire smirked. You do realize he's probably smarter than you, right?
John glared. That's not possible.
Charlie, grinning up at them, looked suspiciously smug. When they finally reached John's house, Claire hesitated at the doorstep. John braced himself for the inevitable, a polite smile. This was fun, but I don't think this is going to work speech. After all, who in their right mind would stick around after this? But instead, Claire just smiled.
Despite everything, I actually had a good time.
John blinked. You what?
Claire laughed. I mean, it was chaotic, but it was also fun.
John stared at her, trying to determine if she was serious, or if she had suffered a head injury when she fell over laughing earlier. Charlie thumped his tail against Claire's leg, clearly pleased with himself. Claire bent down, scratching his ears.
I think I'm starting to like you, troublemaker.
Charlie sighed contentedly, leaning into her touch. John watched the exchange with mild suspicion. Charlie had spent 2 entire dates trying to ruin this, and yet, now that Claire was actually sticking around, he was accepting her without a fight. Almost like...
John narrowed his eyes. Wait, was this your plan all along?
Charlie wagged his tail.
Claire laughed. John, are you accusing your dog of orchestrating a slow-burn matchmaking plot?
John hesitated. That sounded insane, and yet, Charlie smirked probably.
John sighed. I don't know how, but I swear he's been plotting something.
Claire grinned. Well, whatever it is, it's working.
And before John could fully process what she meant, she leaned in and kissed his cheek. John froze. Charlie, watching very closely, let out a dramatic sigh, as if to say, "Finally, you idiot."
Claire stepped back, smirking. See you soon?
John nodded slowly, brain struggling to catch up. Claire waved and walked away. John stood there for a full minute, trying to process the fact that he, somehow, hadn't completely ruined things. Then he looked down at Charlie. Charlie wagged his tail, entirely too pleased with himself.
Sighed.
Charlie barked once. Of course he did. John had always believed in simple, logical explanations. Numbers made sense, probabilities were predictable, dogs did not secretly mastermind their owners' love lives. And yet, here he was, staring at Charlie, who was watching him knowingly, tail wagging like a puppeteer who had just successfully pulled the right strings.
John sighed. You're enjoying this, aren't you?
Charlie tilted his head, playing innocent.
John narrowed his eyes. You sabotaged 2 dates, then let Claire in the moment she passed some invisible test in your head. What's your angle?
Charlie blinked. Then, ever so casually, he wandered to the couch, grabbed one of John's socks, and trotted off like a king who had more important things to do.
Unbelievable. Please tell me you ruined your own life again. It brings me joy.
John scowled.
I did not ruin my life.
Tom gasped.
Wait, does that mean she actually agreed to another date?
John hesitated.
Yes.
Tom whooped.
Finally, love wins. Romance isn't dead. This is historic.
John rubbed his temples.
Tom.
But Tom wasn't listening. He was too busy cheering for Charlie in the background.
Good boy, Charlie.
Tom called.
Knew you could do it, buddy.
John blinked.
Wait, what does that mean?
Tom laughed.
Oh, come on, you think this was your doing?
John's stomach dropped.
Are you telling me that my own best friend was in cahoots with my dog?
Tom grinned audibly.
Listen, man, I simply trusted the process.
John groaned.
This is ridiculous.
Tom chuckled.
Ridiculously effective.
John hung up. From the corner of the room, Charlie sighed contentedly, chewing on his stolen sock.
John crossed his arms. I should have gotten a goldfish.
Charlie thumped his tail. John paced the living room, still processing the greatest betrayal of his life. Charlie, his supposedly loyal golden retriever, had teamed up with Tom to manipulate him into dating again.
John pointed a finger at Charlie, who lay sprawled on the couch, completely unbothered. I trusted you,
John said. Charlie yawned.
I fed you, walked you, gave you a home.
John continued.
And in return, you conspire against me with Tom of all people.
Charlie thumped his tail against the cushions, completely unapologetic. John groaned and grabbed his phone.
I cannot believe you and my dog formed an alliance behind my back. Believe it. Also, you're welcome.
John scowled.
If Charlie and I ever overthrow the government, you will not be part of the revolution. That's fair, but I will take credit when you and Claire get married.
John immediately turned off his phone. Charlie, sensing his victory, hopped off the couch and trotted over, tail wagging.
John sighed. You're lucky I like you.
Snee. And just like that, John wasn't mad anymore. Because the truth was, for all his scheming, for all his disasters, Charlie had never led him wrong before. Maybe, just maybe, he knew exactly what he was doing. John had accepted many hard truths in his life. Losing Lily had been the hardest. Letting people back in had been the second hardest. But the most infuriating truth of all, his dog was smarter than him. Charlie had won. John wasn't sure when he had surrendered to the chaos, but at some point he stopped fighting it. He stopped questioning why a dog was better at orchestrating his social life than he was. He stopped pretending he didn't enjoy Claire's company. And perhaps most importantly, he stopped doubting that Charlie had his best interests at heart. Sure, his methods were unorthodox. But as John sat on his couch one quiet evening, Charlie curled up beside him, he realized that, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. Life wasn't the same without Lily. It never would be. But grief didn't mean the world had to stay frozen. And if Charlie had been trying to teach him anything, maybe it was that life was still happening, whether John was ready for it or not. So when Claire texted him that night,
Hey, so I have an idea. Want to do something fun this weekend?
John didn't hesitate.
Sure. What do you have in mind?
Not telling. You'll just have to trust me.
John smirked. Charlie, sensing something was in the works, lifted his head.
John looked at him. Relax. You don't have to sabotage this one.
Charlie tilted his head, considering.
Charlie, no.
Charlie thumped his tail once, as if making no promises. John sighed. Whatever was coming next, he had a feeling Charlie would be involved. John was not a fan of surprises. He liked plans, schedules, and knowing exactly what he was walking into. So when Claire refused to tell him what their weekend plans were, John was concerned. Charlie, on the other hand, seemed deeply invested in whatever was happening. From the moment John started getting ready, Charlie had been watching him closely, tail flicking like he was mentally preparing for battle.
John sighed as he buttoned his shirt. You're staying here this time, okay?
Charlie squinted.
John pointed a finger. I mean it. No escaping, no sabotage, no mysterious teleportation acts.
Charlie wagged his tail. John was not convinced. Claire arrived right on time, smiling like she knew something John didn't.
John raised an eyebrow. Why do I feel like I'm walking into an elaborate prank?
Claire laughed because you have trust issues. Now get in.
John hesitated for half a second before obeying. As they pulled away from his house, he relaxed. No disasters, no dog-related interference. Maybe this would actually be a normal night. Charlie sat at the window, watching John's car disappear down the street. His tail stopped wagging. His human had left him behind. This was unacceptable. Charlie turned his head, deep in thought. He had two choices: accept defeat, take action. It was never really a choice. Charlie trotted to the back door, sniffed around, and with surgical precision nudged the latch open with his nose. The back gate swung free. Charlie wagged his tail. And then, with purpose, he took off into the night. Charlie moved like a professional. His human was out there somewhere, and he had a mission to complete. The streets were quiet, the cool night air ruffling his fur as he trotted confidently down the sidewalk. He had escaped before. He knew the drill. Step 1, find John. Step 2, insert himself into whatever nonsense John was up to. Step 3, ensure he was never left behind again. Simple, effective, foolproof. Charlie's nose twitched as he caught John's scent, faint but distinct. He picked up speed. The game was on. John was already suspicious. They had driven for about 20 minutes, Claire smirking the whole way, refusing to answer any of his questions.
Just trust me,
she kept saying. That phrase did not comfort him. Finally, she pulled into a large, well-lit parking lot. John squinted at the sign. His stomach dropped. Bog Park and Brews, dog-friendly beer garden and play area.
John slowly turned to Claire. Tell me you didn't.
Claire grinned. I absolutely did.
John groaned. Claire, you do realize that if Charlie was here, this would be his personal paradise, right?
Claire laughed. Exactly. That's why I wanted you to see it. I figured, if we're doing this dating thing, I should probably get used to the fact that you come with a co-star.
John stared at her. He wasn't used to this. someone wanting Charlie, someone choosing to embrace the chaos instead of running from it. For a second, he felt his chest tighten, not with grief, but with something else. Something warm.
Claire nudged him. So you ready to hang out with other dog people?
John exhaled.
You realize I'm socially awkward, right?
Claire smirked. Oh, I know. But the good news is, the dogs don't care.
John sighed. Then, resigned to his fate, he followed Claire toward the entrance.
John's so done.
Claire, lying beside him, wheezing from laughter, turned her head toward Charlie. You, she gasped, are the most determined dog I've ever met.
Charlie grinned. John just closed his eyes. His dog had found him again. And this time, he wasn't even mad about it. John lay in the grass, accepting his fate. Charlie had found him. Again, Claire was still laughing, wiping tears from her eyes.
Oh my God, she wheezed. Your dog just pulled off the most cinematic reunion I've ever seen.
John groaned. This isn't cinematic, this is a crime.
Charlie wagged his tail harder, standing proudly over John, like he had just completed an epic rescue mission.
Claire grinned. I think he's trying to tell you something.
Yeah, he's telling me he's the boss of my life.
Charlie licked his face in confirmation.
Claire shook her head. You know, you could have just brought him in the first place.
John exhaled.
You're saying that now, but imagine what this night would have been like if he had started here.
Claire considered this, then nodded. Fair. We probably would have been escorted out in 10 minutes.
Charlie looked incredibly proud of that possibility.
John sighed, so what now?
Claire smirked. Now we go inside and let your chaos machine have the night of his life.
John hesitated. Then, finally surrendering to the inevitable, he stood up, brushing himself off.
Fine.
He muttered.
But if he steals someone's drink, I'm pretending I don't know him.
Charlie barked once, completely ignoring that rule. As they walked in, Charlie immediately became the center of attention. Other dog owners greeted him like he was a celebrity. He's adorable, one woman gushed, scratching behind his ears. He's huge, another guy laughed. Does he always look like he's up to something? Someone else asked.
Yes, he does.
Charlie wagged his tail like a politician on a campaign tour. Then, without hesitation, he stole a tennis ball from another dog and sprinted into the crowd.
Claire watched him go. So, when do we pretend we don't know him?
John exhaled, I'd say right now.
Claire grinned. Too late.
John groaned. But as he watched Charlie bound across the yard, making new friends and living his best life, he realized he wasn't actually mad. This was his life now, and, for the first time in a long time, he wouldn't have it any other way. It took exactly 5 minutes for Charlie to become the most important dog in the beer garden. While other dogs politely played fetch or wrestled in the grass, Charlie was on a mission. A power move. A hostile takeover. John and Claire watched in real time as Charlie stole a tennis ball, then refused to return it. Sniffed the beer of a man who absolutely did not invite him to do so. Inserted himself into a group photo of strangers posing with their dogs. And perhaps most impressively, convinced another dog to surrender its treats without so much as a bark.
Claire leaned over to John. Your dog is a grifter.
John sighed.
He's just working the crowd, she continued, like a golden retriever mafia boss.
By admiring dogs and their humans.
John narrowed his eyes. Claire, he said seriously, I think my dog just became the dog father of this place.
Claire wiped away a tear of laughter. I think you might be right.
Just when John thought the night couldn't get any worse, Charlie pulled his final stunt. As John stood by the fence, watching helplessly, he saw Charlie make his way toward the outdoor seating area where people were enjoying food.
Oh no.
John muttered.
Claire followed his gaze. Oh yes.
Before John could stop him, Charlie executed the perfect heist. A woman at a nearby table had momentarily turned away from her burger. Charlie moved like a shadow, silent, calculated, and in one swift motion, he snatched the bun clean off the plate and trotted away before anyone noticed. John's stomach dropped. Claire gasped. Charlie pranced over to John, bun dangling from his mouth, looking disgustingly proud of himself. John stared. Charlie stared back. John took a deep breath, then gently removed the evidence from Charlie's mouth. Then, after a brief moment of silence, he turned to Claire.
I will pay you $50 to pretend you don't know me right now.
Claire doubled over laughing. And Charlie? Charlie wagged his tail, because tonight he had won again. John knew defeat when he saw it. Charlie had stolen a burger bun, orchestrated a dog park coup, and turned the beer garden into his personal empire. And yet, somehow, no one was mad about it. Instead, the staff loved him. The other dog owners adored him. Even the woman whose burger had been compromised laughed it off, calling Charlie a master thief with excellent taste.
John rubbed his face. I don't know whether to apologize or sell him as a motivational speaker.
Claire smirked. Could go either way, honestly.
Charlie, clearly pleased with the evening's success, trotted up to John and sat beside him, tail wagging. John looked down at him. Charlie stared back, golden eyes full of mischief.
John sighed to win.
Charlie thumped his tail against the ground.
Claire smiled. So does this mean we can do this again?
John hesitated, not because he didn't want to, but because this entire night had been so bizarrely perfect that he almost didn't trust it. But then Claire nudged his arm, and Charlie leaned against his leg. And for the first time in a long time, John felt something like peace. He exhaled, smiled, and said,
Yeah, I think we can.
The night had been a success. His human was happier. The nice lady was sticking around. And Charlie? Charlie had secured his status as the greatest mastermind of all time. As they walked home, John absent-mindedly scratched behind Charlie's ears.
Thanks for looking out for me, buddy.
Charlie wagged his tail. Of course, that was his job, and he'd do it for as long as John needed him to, which, if Charlie had anything to say about it, would be forever. The end.